I never thought a single afternoon could change the way I saw my entire life. I had returned home earlier than usual, just a few minutes, nothing extraordinary. And yet, in those minutes, everything I believed, everything I trusted, unraveled in the quietest way possible. I remember the light first. It wasn't bright or glaring. It was soft, like it always is around that time of day, spilling across the floor and the furniture in the way that made a house feel like a home. I had walked in carrying nothing heavy, just the day's small errands, a bag from the market, a few groceries. I didn't notice anything amiss at first. The house smelled the way it always did of old wood, soap, and the faint scent of the dinner I had forgotten to finish preparing the night before. I set my bag down quietly, because I liked the routine. Even after years of marriage, I still found comfort in little rituals. I called out for my husband in the casual way I always did, expecting maybe an answer, maybe a laugh, maybe nothing at all. The house was quiet, too quiet. I thought maybe he had gone out or was upstairs, or perhaps my son's fiancée had come by for a quick chat. Nothing felt unusual, yet I told myself it was probably nothing, just the kind of small ordinary silence that fills a home sometimes. But then I heard voices, low, familiar. One was his, smooth and calm as always. The other took a moment to register, and when it did, my steps faltered. I recognized it immediately. The voice of the woman my son had chosen to marry. The young woman I had welcomed into my home, hugged, fed, smiled at, and trusted. My chest tightened, my stomach sank, and suddenly the air in the hallway felt heavier. I froze. My first thought was disbelief. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe the sound carried differently through the walls. Maybe nothing was as it seemed. I moved quietly toward the source, careful not to announce my presence, trying to rationalize what I was feeling. My mind raced, but it tried to find logical explanations. They could be talking about wedding plans, I thought. Maybe he had asked her over. Maybe I was imagining it. But as I neared the door, my heart began to hammer. Something in the tone of their conversation, the softness of it, the intimacy, it didn't belong in ordinary family discussion. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see. And yet, I knew I had to. When I pushed the door open slightly, the scene unfolded before me in a way that would be burned into my memory forever. They were sitting close, too close. His hand rested in a place it shouldn't have. Her posture was relaxed, intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. This wasn't a fleeting mistake. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, familiar, something that had been repeated enough times to feel natural to them both. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My body wanted to scream. My mind wanted to turn away. My heart shattered quietly, in slow, deep waves that seemed to move through every part of me. I watched as my husband looked at her with that same warmth he once reserved for me, for our shared life. She looked at him with trust, with something more than affection, something that had no place in my home, no place in the family I had nurtured. When they finally noticed me, I stayed still. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't lunge forward or demand an explanation. I simply stood there, holding the weight of the scene, letting it settle. My husband's face went pale, and she looked startled but not ashamed. She tried to compose herself quickly, as if the act itself could be erased by a shift in posture, a careful smile, a word. But I knew. I had seen enough. I can explain, my husband said, his voice low, urgent, trying to fill the space that my silence had claimed. But I didn't need an explanation. Not yet. The truth had already announced itself. It had arrived quietly, fully, devastatingly, without ceremony or warning. I walked away. Not because I wanted to hide from them, but because I needed to reclaim some small piece of myself before the anger, the hurt, the betrayal could overwhelm me completely. I went into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. My hands shook slightly, not violently, just enough to remind me that my body understood betrayal before my mind did. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, letting the realization sink in. The people I had trusted most, the people I had believed would protect my family, had chosen to deceive me. That evening, I didn't sleep. I listened to my husband moving around the house, hesitant, careful, unsure of what to say or do. He knocked on the door at one point. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. Not for words, not for apologies, not for justifications. Silence felt safer. The betrayal was too large for conversation. Yet, It needed space, reflection, and clarity. And as I sat there, I understood something else. This was no longer just about my marriage. It was about my son, the life he believed he was building, the trust he had placed in both of them. And it was about me, the mother, the wife, the woman who had spent decades building a life of love, patience, and quiet endurance. Now confronted with a truth that would change everything, I would have to navigate this carefully. I would have to observe, understand, and plan my next steps. I had to see how far the betrayal went, whether it was a single moment of weakness or a pattern hidden beneath everyday life. Every glance, every word, every action would matter. And I realized then that patience, clarity, and composure would be my strongest tools. This was the moment everything changed. And I had no choice but to face it. The morning after that afternoon, I moved through the house almost automatically. Coffee brewed, dishes washed, laundry folded. The routines I had built over years became my anchor. They grounded me when the betrayal felt too heavy to carry. Each small task reminded me that the life I had worked for, the family, the home, the stability was still here, even if shaken. I told myself repeatedly that I had to stay steady, for myself and for my son, even though the weight of what I had seen pressed on me with every step. I avoided my husband for the first few days, not out of fear, and not out of spite, but because I needed space. I needed distance to think. He tried to speak to me several times, apologizing, explaining, trying to justify. I listened politely, answered calmly, and excused myself. I realized quickly that nothing he said could undo what I had witnessed. Nothing he could offer would restore my trust overnight. And yet, he seemed to believe that by keeping his distance and speaking gently, he could prevent the storm from breaking. He underestimated the quiet strength of observation, of patience. During those same days, I kept my distance from my son too. I didn't want to taint his excitement about his wedding, his trust in the people he loved, with the truth I now held. But I watched him from afar sometimes and tried to gauge his happiness, his expectations. I reminded myself that protecting him also meant choosing the right time to reveal the betrayal, not rushing in with accusations before I had the full picture. I needed clarity for myself first, before I could help him navigate a reality that would inevitably hurt him deeply. I began to notice things I had ignored before, subtle patterns that, in hindsight, pointed to what had been happening behind my back. My husband's sudden interest in small, meaningless details, restaurants, music, movies, things that now seemed to align with her preferences. Moments when he left the house unexpectedly. How she lingered longer than necessary, always finding ways to be near him. All those little pieces that had seemed harmless now clicked into place like a puzzle I had refused to complete until I had proof. I also reflected on our early years. How we had built a life slowly, carefully, together. The shared moments, the sacrifices, the decisions made with the family in mind. The thought that someone could quietly infiltrate that, manipulate that, and twist it into something destructive made my chest ache. I realized that betrayal isn't always loud or explosive. It's often quiet, methodical, happening in shadows while life continues, unnoticed until a single moment forces it into light. I began keeping small notes to myself. Dates, times, odd behaviors, things my husband said, things she said. Not as evidence, not as a trap, just as a way to organize the chaos in my mind. It helped me feel grounded, to see patterns emerge that I couldn't deny. Each note was a step toward understanding, toward preparation. I wanted to be certain before I confronted anyone. I didn't want anger or confusion to cloud judgment. Some nights, I would lie awake and replay the scene in my head. The way he looked at her, the way she didn't flinch, the intimacy that had no place in our home. And I would feel waves of grief, not just for the marriage, but for my son, for the family I had trusted, for the illusions of loyalty I had believed in. I grieved quietly, without tears most of the time, because crying wouldn't change the truth. Only clarity, observation, and patient action could. I also noticed subtle shifts in my own perspective. Where once I might have blamed myself for small cracks in our marriage, now I saw clearly that the fault lay elsewhere. Not that I was perfect, but that manipulation, deception, and betrayal were choices made consciously by others. That realization gave me a measure of strength I hadn't expected to find. It was quiet, but unshakable. I continued to move through my days with care. I cooked, cleaned, and tended to the home as I always had. I spoke to neighbors and friends politely, kept routines intact, and smiled when necessary. But beneath the calm exterior, I was observing, watching patterns, listening for inconsistencies, noting moments that might confirm or deny my growing suspicions. I had learned that in situations like these, patience and careful observation could be more powerful than confrontation. I began to notice subtle changes in her behavior too. She seemed slightly more guarded, though she had no reason to suspect I had caught anything. She lingered less in the house, avoided prolonged eye contact, and began consulting my son more directly than before. It wasn't enough to confront her yet, but enough to make me realize that the truth, even unspoken, began to affect her. That quiet shift in her confidence was a small reassurance to me that my careful observation was not wasted. I didn't rush anything. Every interaction, every detail mattered. I observed and noted, prepared myself for the right time to act. And in that preparation, I found a sense of control that had been absent since the initial discovery. Not control over them, not control over the betrayal itself, but control over my own response, my own decisions, my own future. There were moments of reflection when I thought about my son and what he deserved, how much he trusted us both, how deeply he believed in the life we were building together. Protecting him meant ensuring that when he did learn the truth, he would do so from a place of clarity, not confusion. That became my focus, ensuring that when the moment came, it would be the right moment, approached with calm, patience, and careful thought. By the end of the week, I realized that in this slow burn of awareness, observation, and preparation, I had regained a measure of strength I didn't know I still had. The initial shock had faded into clarity. The hurt had sharpened into focus. And though the path ahead remained uncertain and painful, I knew that I would face it with patience, dignity, and the quiet resolve of someone who had learned to see clearly and act deliberately. The tension in the house grew quietly, without any loud arguments or visible confrontations. It wasn't the kind of tension that announces itself with slammed doors or raised voices. It was in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the subtle shifts in the air that told me he knew I had seen more than I let on. My husband became cautious, careful in his words, measured in his gestures. Not apologetic, not remorseful, just cautious. And that caution told me more than any confession ever could. I noticed how often he now paused before speaking, choosing his sentences as if weighing their consequences on my silence. He would smile politely, nod in agreement, but there was a stiffness to his presence, a tension that hadn't been there before. I listened, I observed, I kept my composure. Every word I didn't speak, every question I didn't ask, became a part of the pressure I quietly applied. The power of silence is often underestimated. It can be heavier than any outburst, stronger than any accusation. And I wielded it carefully. Her behavior changed too. She became quieter around me, more tentative. She lingered less when she came over, avoided my gaze, spoke softly and cautiously. I knew that my calm observation had unsettled her, even if she didn't realize why. People like her assume that deception is enough to keep their actions hidden, but they forget that patience and steady awareness can uncover more than any argument. I watched her closely, noting the changes in tone, the small pauses, the subtle shifts in her confidence. Meanwhile, my son remained blissfully unaware, immersed in his plans for the wedding, trusting both of them implicitly. It was almost unbearable to watch, to see his excitement and hope, knowing the truth that lurked beneath the surface. I told myself repeatedly that I could not rush him into understanding. He needed to remain unbroken, at least for now. The right time would come, and I had to be ready, not angry, not rash, but prepared with clarity and calm. Small moments of manipulation and deceit became increasingly obvious as I paid attention. The way they coordinated their absences, the subtle glances, the careful timing of conversations, it all formed a pattern that left little room for doubt. I began keeping notes, dates, times, behaviors, snippets of conversations, not to trap anyone, not to provoke a confrontation, but to organize my thoughts, to create a clear picture for when the time came to act. I started noticing the little things I had ignored before. My husband's sudden interest in her hobbies, the way he seemed to mirror her preferences, their casual laughter when they thought no one was watching. All the small, ordinary seeming moments that now carried a weight I could not ignore. Each one added to the story I had already begun to understand. Some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything I had seen, and piecing together months of subtle clues. I realized that betrayal rarely comes as a dramatic moment. It builds quietly, in shadows, in silences, in the spaces between words and gestures. It is methodical, persistent, and often disguised as ordinary life until a single revelation exposes it completely. I also reflected on my own reactions. I had learned over the years to stay calm, to endure, to maintain order, even when chaos threatened. That endurance became my ally. Now, my silence, my steady presence, my refusal to confront hastily, all worked to my advantage. I had clarity. I had observation. I had time. And those were more powerful than any outburst could have been. As days turned into a week, the tension continued to simmer. My husband tried small gestures, politeness, attentiveness, minor acts of consideration, but nothing could undo what had already been revealed in my mind. The trust between us had shifted. The power balance had changed. And though he did not yet fully understand it, I did. I had quietly taken control through awareness, through patience, through calm observation. I realized that my role had changed too. I was no longer just a wife in a household. I was a guardian of truth, of my son's well-being, of the integrity of our family. Every interaction, every observation, every small decision became part of a larger plan. I had to navigate carefully, to wait for the right moment, to let the rising tension reveal itself fully before acting. There were moments when I felt anger, yes, but I let it settle into focus rather than explode into confrontation. The subtle power of quiet resolve became my tool. I didn't need to raise my voice to assert authority. I didn't need to demand answers to hold control. Simply observing, waiting, and understanding had shifted the entire dynamic in ways they hadn't anticipated. And then, little by little, the signs of their own unraveling began. Her confidence wavered, his certainty faltered, and the cracks in their quiet deception became visible, even if neither of them admitted it. The rising tension was no longer just in my awareness, it was palpable. They began to behave differently, not because I forced it, but because truth has a way of reshaping behavior even before it is spoken aloud. I felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever, not just for myself, not just for confronting betrayal, but for protecting my son from a reality he was not yet ready to face. I watched him, planned, prepared. Every small choice I made, every pause, every careful word, was with him in mind. He deserved to know, but not until it could be done with clarity, calm, and strength. The rising conflict had become a quiet storm in our household. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was slow, patient, deliberate. And as I moved through it, I realized something fundamental. Power in a situation like this doesn't come from anger or shouting. It comes from patience, observation, clarity, and timing. And I had all of those. The day I finally confronted the truth, I remember standing in the hallway, feeling the weight of every choice they had made bearing down on me. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't explosive. I had watched, I had waited, I had observed, and now the moment had arrived. The calm that had carried me through the last weeks felt steady, grounding, and I knew that I could face whatever came next without losing myself. My son had come by, unexpectedly early, unaware that the air in the house had shifted so completely. He laughed softly as he stepped inside, talking about plans for the weekend, about friends, about wedding preparations. I listened politely, letting him speak, letting him believe in the ordinary day he expected. And when he paused, I asked him to sit with me. My voice was calm, even deliberate. There was nothing theatrical about it. No anger in the words themselves, just clarity. He looked at me, sensing that something serious had come into the room, something that would change the day, the week, perhaps even the shape of his life. I told him to listen carefully, that I had something important to explain, and that he must hear it all before reacting. He nodded, quiet now, alert, waiting. I began slowly, carefully, recounting the details I had observed over the past weeks. The moments I had noticed, the absences, the subtle behaviors, the silences. I didn't embellish. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I spoke in calm, measured sentences, letting the reality unfold in his mind gradually. As I recounted the afternoon when I had come home early, when I saw what I could never unsee, I noticed his face change, confusion first, then disbelief, then a quiet, sinking understanding. He didn't speak immediately. He just absorbed each word, processing them against the reality he had believed in. When he finally asked, "How long?" I answered honestly. Every month, every small step, every hidden moment that had led to this. He stayed silent, staring at the floor, his hands gripping the edges of the chair as if it could hold him together. I reached for his hand, and he squeezed it briefly. We sat in quiet solidarity, not because the pain was gone, but because there was clarity now, where before there had only been doubt. That evening, my husband came home. The house felt different. There was a stillness in the air that I had cultivated through weeks of observation and patience. I asked him to sit, and I didn't explain. I didn't recount the evidence. I simply said, "I know." The words themselves carried more weight than anything else could. He tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to justify, but I cut him off gently, calmly, without raising my voice. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need excuses. I only needed acknowledgement, and he knew that I understood everything. The shift in the house after that was quiet but unmistakable. He became cautious, hesitant, careful in ways that were entirely new. No longer could he rely on ignorance, or my silence, or the appearance of normalcy. The quiet power of awareness had become mine, and it was more effective than any argument or confrontation could have been. She too changed. She avoided me when she came over, spoke carefully, lingered less. Her confidence, once steady and assured, now had small cracks. Not because I sought to punish her, but because the truth has a way of unraveling people on its own. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand explanations. Her own awareness of being discovered, even unspoken, reshaped her behavior. In the days that followed, we all navigated a new reality. The engagement ended quietly. My son confronted her privately, learned what he needed to know. My husband attempted gestures of reconciliation, but I saw through them with a calm clarity that left nothing unexamined. The power balance had shifted permanently, not through anger, but through truth, patience, and deliberate observation. And through it all, I realized something important. Betrayal does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it grows quietly, methodically, in shadows. And when it is finally revealed, the strength to respond does not come from anger or confrontation. It comes from clarity, from calm, from the steady understanding of what has occurred and what cannot be allowed to continue. I had discovered that my own strength, quiet and unyielding, was far more powerful than their deception. And in that moment, I understood that facing betrayal with calm and observation can restore control in ways nothing else can. The days after the revelation were quieter than I had expected. The house no longer carried the false warmth it once had, but there was a clarity in the stillness that I hadn't felt before. The routines continued: cooking, cleaning, tending to the garden, but every movement felt purposeful now. I was no longer just maintaining a household. I was navigating the aftermath of a betrayal that had cut through the very fabric of our family, and I moved carefully, deliberately, with each step considered. My husband's presence was different. He no longer assumed comfort or forgiveness. Each word he spoke was measured, each gesture calculated. It was clear to him now that silence and patience had shifted the balance of power. I did not scold him. I did not demand apologies at every turn. I simply existed in the home with awareness, and that alone reminded him of the consequences of his choices. He tried to engage, to reassert normalcy, but the invisible line had been drawn. I was no longer someone to be deceived lightly. My son's recovery was slower, more fragile. He oscillated between anger, disbelief, and profound sadness. I did not rush him. I let him navigate the grief in his own time, knowing that he needed space to process the enormity of what had happened. Each time he came to me, he sought clarity, not comfort. He needed facts, not consolation. And I gave them to him calmly, gently, ensuring that he could see the truth without feeling consumed by it. There were moments that felt almost ordinary. Meals shared at the table, a quiet television in the evening. Even the mundane tasks of shopping and errands took on a new significance. They were reminders that life continued, even in the wake of profound betrayal. And in those moments, I discovered a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The shock, the hurt, the grief, they were still there, but they no longer dictated my actions. I moved through them with deliberate awareness, not reaction. The woman, my son's former fiancée, withdrew. She tried to salvage some dignity, but there was no place for her within the family she had violated. She avoided contact, avoided conversation, and eventually, she faded from our lives entirely. It was not vengeance that drove this outcome. It was the natural consequence of her actions, quietly imposed through the truth that could not be denied. I did not celebrate her absence. I simply observed it, letting it mark the end of a chapter that had no room for her in the family's future. My husband attempted reconciliation. Small gestures, polite inquiries, tentative conversations. He sought to bridge the gap to regain trust. I responded with calm neutrality. I acknowledged him, I answered questions, but I did not provide comfort. I did not offer forgiveness prematurely. He had made choices that could not be undone, and I allowed him to understand that every effort to restore normalcy must be matched by accountability, awareness, and sustained change. Through all of this, I discovered a quiet form of empowerment, not the triumph of confrontation, not the satisfaction of revenge, but the strength that comes from observing clearly, choosing carefully, and responding deliberately. I realized that emotional justice does not always arrive in dramatic displays. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and deeply enduring. It is the awareness of truth, the refusal to accept deception, and the careful nurturing of one's own integrity in the face of betrayal. I watched my son rebuild himself, slowly regaining his confidence, his trust in the world, his sense of hope. He leaned on me when necessary, and I provided what he needed, not overprotection, not coddling, but steady support grounded in reality. And as he grew stronger, so did I. The home, once a place of quiet and ease, began to feel like a space of stability again. Not because the betrayal had been forgotten, but because the consequences had been faced, acknowledged, and navigated with care. I understood then that betrayal does not end with discovery. Its consequences ripple outward, affecting every relationship, every routine, every interaction. But facing those consequences with clarity, calm, and patience allows healing to take root. I did not reclaim everything that had been lost: love, trust, innocence, but I reclaimed something perhaps more important: my own agency, my own strength, my own voice. And in that reclamation, I found a sense of balance. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I no longer needed to act out of anger or desperation. I moved through the house, through my life, with steady awareness. I had endured the shock, observed the betrayal, and now, in its quiet aftermath, I could begin to live fully again, anchored by the clarity of truth and the knowledge that some forms of power, patience, observation, calm resolve cannot be taken from you. No matter how deep the wound,